Good evening. Let's go back in time 150 or so years. It's the middle of the 19th century. The situation in Europe, as in most of the known world, was that it had suffered through the effects of 1,000 years or so of history that had not been kind to people like you and me. The whole system as it was then had done its best to keep the masses down where they should be. The state, through various monarchies and so on, had kept them dirt poor. The church had done its best to keep them ignorant. Men of science like Charles Darwin, the gentleman in the photo, were in the process of asking questions about the big issues of life. Where did we come from, for one? So, from the mid-1800s, this became a hot topic, and it has remained so ever since. Well, if we skipped 100 years or so, we come to around 1967. Now, I was a bright-eyed third former at a local high school, and the science teacher showed us this diagram of the progression of man, and he linked that with Charles Darwin and his giant Galapagos tortoises, and explained where we came from, and to me the explanation sounded very plausible. Darwin's ideas were backed up with solid archaeological evidence, or so it seemed, and the alternative was not discussed at all in any serious way. So, for a number of years, this is what I was convinced actually happened. I am absolutely certain if we asked the man in the street how he came to be here, then these diagrams would come into his answer in some form. So, what's the problem with that? Well, what it does, of course, is it provides a solution where God does not exist and has had no part in any of what we see and experience. It replaces the core of Bible teaching with an array of ideas we have placed under the umbrella of this one word, evolution. But is this really how we got here? Is it really the only logical explanation? Well, we're convinced that this is not the case. The alternative, of course, is creation. Now, if one single word of this Bible is true, then it's all got to be true. And if we could get ourselves to that point, then our lives would be so much the richer for it. That's the position that I now take, and that we all take, and we wouldn't deviate from it under any circumstances. But the debate, and this picture just kind of embodies that debate. Like I said, it affected me during high school when we were told about Darwin's ideas, and that we were told that he was right, and that's how we got here. And creation was, during my time anyway, was not even mentioned, but it was seen as an explanation for the weak and the simple of mind who couldn't come to grips with the reality of the scientific answers that had come forth from people like Darwin. And so the debate wages on. And we have to ask the verse 1 true, or is there really another explanation? Well, this guy Marconi, who invented the radio, these ideas have been around from time immemorial. He said the uniformity of Earth's life, more astonishing than its diversity, so it's more astonishing that things are so similar, is accountable by the high probability that we derived originally from some single cell fertilised in a bolt of lightning as the Earth cooled. And that's the kind of core of the ideas that people like Darwin may have started their work off with. But then again, Sir Isaac Newton, who we're with and would have a lot of respect for his ideas, said, how came the bodies of animals to be contrived with so much art? And for what ends were there several parts? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics, and the ear without knowledge of sounds? See, in around about the same time, he had looked at these things and come at it from an entirely different view and said, this can't have been a result of an accident, surely. There must have been an intelligent designer behind it all. Well, what I'd like to suggest is that we run our story this evening on the basis of these two men. Don't they look similar? You'd think they could have been brothers. They were born around about the same time. John Thomas was born in 1805 and Darwin 4 years later in 1809. Thomas was born in London and Darwin was born not a couple of hundred k's away in a place called Shrewsbury, not the biscuit. They both died within cooey of each other, and they have both been pretty influential on the way we think. Darwin was the son of a minister, so he had a real background in the church and church affairs, and he wanted to be a doctor. But in medical school, they did an operation, so the story goes, on a little girl without anaesthetic, and Charles Darwin decided he wanted to be something else. Couldn't stand the sight of blood, so they say. John Thomas, who was born around about the same time, actually did become a doctor. So, amazing coincidences. Charles Darwin decided, after he knew he didn't want to become a doctor, he decided to, and a relative of his happened to get him on a ship, the HMS Beagle, which did a 5-year journey from England around into the southern oceans and actually stopped in New Zealand here for about 9 days in 1836 or so. John Thomas also went on a journey. He grabbed up his family and decided to go across to America to live, as a doctor, no doubt. His ship banged into an island just short of the United States, and Dr. John Thomas decided that he didn't know much of his future, he didn't know much about the Bible, even though he'd been brought up around it, and that if he ever got out of this alive, he was going to make it his life's work to find out. So, interesting that their paths were sort of paralleling along the way. John Thomas would train as a doctor. He did actually find out what the Bible really taught, and he sharpened his understanding on some of the religious groups that were in the States at the time, and finally went back to England where he preached and so on. Well, what did they have in common? Thomas was apparently not satisfied with the church teachings because he wanted to find out what the Bible wanted to say for himself. He turned specifically to the Bible for the answers that it had. He wrote a book, a copy of which I have here, one of a couple that he wrote, Elpis Israel, and he attracted what was to be a long-term following, which is why most of us are in the hall here now. Charles Darwin wasn't happy with church teachings either, or wondered about them. He thought he might go off and see the world and observe for himself what had gone on. He rather reluctantly wrote a book in about 1859, and he too has attracted a very strong, very, very vociferous long-term following. So it's kind of the story of evolution for us in the hall anyway, is about these two men, largely, and we have to say the only one talking this kind of evolutionary development. He came after a fairly long line of people who'd thought kind of similar things. But this Origin of Species was published in November of 1859, and people who are tied up in the scientific world still look at it as a work to be looked at with some reverence. And the full title of it originally, when he first wrote it, was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. That says it all, really. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. That's what he called it. No wonder he shortened it down. To be covered in the second of the books that I think is probably worth looking at. The first words of our other man in his book were, or the ones that I've written there really, revolving upon its own axis and describing an ample circuit through the boundless fields of space, is a planet of the solar system bearing upon its surface a population of over 1,000 million subject to sin. Well, there's a lot more than that now, and death. This orb of the starry heaven shines with a glory similar to that of its kindred spheres. Viewed from them it is seen sparkling like a diamond in the sky, and with the rest of the heavens declares the glory of God and shows forth the handiwork of him that did create it. So he's poles apart positions when you have a look at the two men. Well, what was in Darwin's mind when he set off on the Beagle that he had is, I've got the quote here, he said, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent or a loving and thoughtful God and omnipotent God would have designedly created parasitic wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living of caterpillars." That was one of the things that kind of annoyed him a bit, or that he wondered about. How could God have created a wasp whose sole means of producing young was to lay the eggs inside a living organism or caterpillar? And I guess we can understand why he would be wondering that. Dr. Thomas? Well, he said himself, "I wrote Elpis Israel to clear away the rubbish of the pulpits, the things that the churches were teaching, with which the readers might be oppressed, that the light of God might enter in." So they both kind of had a position which they were taking when they wrote their books. Well, Darwin, he set off in 1831. He had studied at Cambridge University. He got an arts degree. Like I said, he didn't finish his medical degree. Instead, what he thought he might do was study divinity, which is what he did, and become a pastor in a small church. What he was really interested in was natural history. So his real love was natural history, and he thought it would fit nicely into the life of a clergyman in a backwater country church. But he set off, and like I said, he even visited New Zealand in the Bay of Islands around Christmas of, must have been 1836, coming near the end of his voyage. And we know that he visited the Galapagos Islands out here off South America, and a lot of his observations were to do with that. So in this 5 years of voyaging, what conclusions did he come to? Well, he figured that individuals in nature differ from one another. He could see that. We can all see that. He said organisms in nature produce more offspring than can possibly survive. And many of those who don't survive, or who will not survive, the ones that are not the strongest, won't reproduce. Fair enough. That's what does happen in nature. He said that because more organisms are produced than can survive, each species then has to struggle for its survival. And that's where he got the survival of the fittest idea. He said each organism is unique. Yep, he was right. Each has advantages and disadvantages as it struggles for its existence. And he said only individuals best suited for the environment that they're living in will reproduce. And he said species change over time. They get better and better and better. And I don't know if we'd agree with him there. In fact, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't. In 1967, when I was first in, the evidence seemed to point very much to what was being told us. Well, he looked at the fossil record and he said, simpler things right at the bottom of the fossil record, more complicated things further up. He said, if you've got a geographical location, and this is where he got excited about the Galapagos Islands, if you've got a geographical location, you get, with a similar kind of environment, you get similar kind of organisms living there. He had a problem when he got to Australia, when he saw the grasslands over this side. He said, how come they haven't got rabbits here? He said, how come they haven't got kangaroos in England? Be a good place for them. But he couldn't answer those questions, of course. He saw then that the animals that he observed and drew and so on had homologous body structures. They kind of looked the same, and we'll look at that shortly. And he looked at the tiny embryonic development of the animals that he looked at, and he saw that they were remarkably similar. And so he said, we all came from the same thing. We all look the same when we're little, and we just develop into different animals. We must have come from the same. Well, there is a problem, however. Well, there's a problem for us. There probably wasn't a problem for Darwin, as it turns out. The problem is the age of the Earth. for animals to have changed the way he thought that they had changed in such a gradual way and just tiny incremental changes, the Earth had to be millions or hundreds of millions of years old. And now I notice scientists are talking about billions of years old. He looked at things like this giant armadillo and the giant anteater and places that he went and said, you know, they must have come from the same animal, but it would have taken a lot of gradual change for them to have started off as one or an ancestor of these and separately developed in separate places. I think if you are at all interested in the Bible, it shows a much simpler picture. It says that everything that he made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Not the 600 millionth year, not the 600,000th year, but the sixth day of that Genesis 1 period of time. And what we would say is Darwin was not right when he said it had to stretch back millennia for this to work. The second problem, Charles Darwin, if you have a look at his book Origin of the Species, he's got a little tree that grows up from several different kinds of animals and gets more complicated as different species branch off it. He actually had to admit that life as we know it started off very simple. It had to have. He said the intimate relationship between the vital phenomena with chemistry, its laws, makes the idea of spontaneous generation conceivable. Oh dear. This is the primordial puddle kind of a scenario where the chemicals were in there and something reacted with them, like Marconi said, maybe lightning strike, and there was something living. So from that he kind of had to say, or evolutionists have had to say anyway, that the first organisms had to be just these little single cell blobby bacteria things, and as time went on they became